Hello, everybody, and welcome to Lit Fic with a Mighty Blaze. The blaze was sparked in 2020 when COVID-19 extinguished the traditional in-person book tour. Our New York Times bestselling authors and co-founders Jenna Blum and Carolyn Levitt joined forces to promote books that are coming out. I am Bo Ellis, the Facebook director of The Blaze and a writer myself. I'm also mildly injured, but please ignore that. This week we have the amazing author JANE DELURY. JANE DELURY is the author of The Balcony, a novel and stories which won the Sue Kaufman Prize for First Fiction from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And she has a new novel, Hedge, which came out just this week from Zibby Books. Her stories have appeared in the Granta, the Suwannee Review, the Southern Review, the Yale Review, Glimmer Train Narrative, and other publications. And she lives in Baltimore with her daughters and her partner, who is also a writer, named Dawn Lee. So, hello, Jane. How are you doing today?
Hello. Thank you so much for having me on. I love Mighty Blaze, and I'm thrilled to be here.
Yes, we're thrilled to have you. So can you tell us a little bit about Hedge, which has now available for everybody to go and get?
Absolutely. So Hedge is a novel about a garden historian who is from the Bay Area. She moves to England when she's young and trains as a garden historian, which means she goes to estates from the past and brings their gardens back to life by looking at the soil and the topography. And so at the opening of Hedge, she has left England and has moved back to the Bay Area with her husband, Peter, and her two daughters, Ella and Louise. She's very unhappy in her marriage. It's been going on for a while, and her career is stalled. So she takes a job restoring a garden on an estate in the Hudson Valley. And while she's there waiting for her daughters, she becomes close to an archaeologist on the grounds. And then her daughters soon show up and disaster ensues. In short.
Yes. No. And I loved Hedge. The disaster that ensued, I really did not see coming at all. And I don't want to spoil what it is because I think it's really best if you read the book and just see what happens for yourself. But I was definitely so shocked when I got to near the end of part one.
And so it's a little hard to talk about the plot of this book.
Yes.
And if people find out what happens in advance, I think you can still get something out of reading the book. Absolutely. But I did want the reader to be there with Maud. You know, she's in this new phase of life. She thinks she's finally free. She's going to create this great life for her and the girls. And I wanted the rug pulled out from under the reader along with her so that they would be on that journey that she ends up going on over the course of the book.
Mm-hmm. And that, I can say I absolutely had that experience where I was kind of going along with Maud and this sort of life she was imagining. And I was like, wow, that sounds so nice. But of course, maybe I should have realized this is a third halfway through the book. I was like, well, it can't be resolving now. This isn't a novella. So.
Right. That's true. The length of the book always gives you a clue, doesn't it? Yeah. And actually the second part of the book, as you know, jumps to 2 years later when she's back in the Bay Area trying to untangle what happened that summer in New York. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Which I really love that this novel is both about Maud, not just with Maud navigating her life, but it's also very much about her navigating her family and specifically her daughters and how she can connect with them and how that connection sort of gets stronger and wavers. And I am somebody who currently does not have any children, but I mentioned to you earlier before we went live, Maud reminded me a lot of my mother due to the fact that she was a gardener. My mother is a huge gardening lover, so I grew up in gardens all the time as a kid, learning a lot from her. So I was like, that's probably somewhat of what she went through with me when I was 13 years old. And of course, a massive pain, like every 13-year-old in the world kind of is, even if they're also great.
Yeah,
still frustrated.
The teenage years can be rough. I think, for me, even though there is a romance definitely in this book, it really is, it's about It's a mother-daughter. I would say that's kind of the primary relationship, Maud and her two daughters, that evolves, as you say, over the course of the book. And then I was also interested in exploring the tensions of being a woman with passions and with ambitions, but also having that responsibility to children and to that very role of being a mother. What does that mean? And so I think she's trying to navigate that over the course of the novel.
And I think you handle it beautifully, and I loved reading about it. I love stories a lot that are about mother-daughter connections. I think we can all, whether you are neither a mother or a daughter, I think there's always something to be gained from reading this. And this is a really, really beautiful journey, I think, of a novel. And it comes with also a lot of amazing gardening facts that a lot of people probably don't know, because I know a fair amount about gardening, but I didn't know anything about gardening history. So I did want to ask, when did you learn about this job of being a garden historian? Because it's not common in the States.
Yeah, well, I've always been interested in history and historic sites from being a kid. My dad was a big history buff, so I spent a lot of time, like we could not drive down a street past a historic plaque in California without the car pulling over. So, and I always had sort of even though I wasn't writing fiction yet, a fiction writer's connection to history. Like, immediately I would start imagining what the landscape would look like, or a house had looked like, 200, or a street had looked like 200-300 years ago. Garden history in particular, I think it really, I became really interested in it in writing this book. So I was, the seed for the novel actually came to me at the Presidio in San Francisco, where the second part of the novel takes place. I was jogging there. My mother had rented, I'm from Sacramento nearby, and we were having family reunions at this house on the edge of the park. And I started running every morning, and I discovered the footprint of an adobe house that once belonged to Juana Briones, who's known as the mother of San Francisco. She was this amazing Mexican-American figure in California history, about whom very little is written about. And she was a healer with the native plants of the Presidio. And so I started to read about that and read about the archaeology that had been done to try to understand how she, her sisters, and her father lived on this site at the Presidio. And the archaeological team found traces of plants. They didn't find an actual garden, but that was really what sparked. I thought, well, she would have had a garden, and what would that garden have contained, and how do you find that out? And it turns out there's a whole world of gardening history where these experts can go and look at the soil and figure out what grew. And so it really was this book that got me interested in this profession.
Yeah, it's certainly a profession that I am very interested in now. While I'm myself not as much of a gardener as my mother was, I have a lot of respect for it, and that makes me interested if maybe there's anything like that happening in my area to check out. And what was your research for that like? Like, did you visit any other restoration sites, or just a lot of reading on your own?
I definitely did a lot of reading. I did a lot of reading about what has happened and what is happening in the UK in particular in these restorations. There's a lot online. But then Monticello is only a few hours from Baltimore, and it's the site of a major garden restoration that happened in the 1970s with lots of documentation about how that was done. So my kind of hands-on research happened there. I was welcomed in by the head of archaeology and the head of grounds and gardens, and learned about how that restoration happened in the 1970s and really what it means. What's the difference between a garden that belongs to the 21st century and a garden that still belongs to the 18th century? And how do you compost? How do you do weed prevention? How do you if you're trying to replicate the way things were done in the past? So then I kind of took that, what I learned, and I moved it to the Hudson Valley, to this estate, Montgomery Place, where I had more experts helping me. So basically, I just try to find experts who are generous enough to talk to me. And I was really lucky in that regard with this book.
And that is great. And I know There's been a lot of people in my own writing who I've pestered for research, and I just love finding an expert who's passionate about stuff, but who's also passionate about sharing that knowledge. And so I know a lot of experts I've met love that somebody's asking them.
Absolutely. And so much of it is so detailed. I mean, for example, Fraser Neiman, the head of archaeology at Monticello, has spent 20 years meticulously looking at ceramic shards around the mountain to find out more about the people who lived on the mountain of Monticello, and who, the enslaved community and different communities that lived on the mountain, and find out about their lives by looking at the soil. And it's incredibly technical, and it's not Indiana Jones archaeology. Yeah. And so just to be sort of welcomed into that science was great. But, you do have to put out a lot of feelers, right? I mean, I got really lucky, but I also reached out to people who were probably like, who the hell is this novelist in Baltimore that wants to talk to me? So, yeah, you have to be brave and just, send those emails, I think.
Mm-hmm. And it's great that you did. I also did love, you've mentioned looking at indigenous groups and enslaved groups. And I love that your novel also very much included them in the history of America, when we so often your novel is not historical fiction, but it deals so much with history.
Right.
And that can often get very whitewashed because it's not fun, I guess, or it's something you just want to ignore. So I appreciated that your novel refused to do that.
Yeah, and I really did try. And again, there's so much research I couldn't put in this novel. I've joked that my next book is just going to be all the research. I'm just going to put all the research I did that I want the world to read, and I won't even have to, create a plot. How wonderful! But doing this kind of research, you also see who gets to tell their story. I mean, this is kind of an obvious thing to say, but where's the written record? And there's so much history where there is absolutely no written record, right, in California. I mean, this story of Juana Briones, there's very, very little written about her. So using science and looking at the soil allows some stories to be told that wouldn't be told otherwise, which I think is just wonderful. But it was also frustrating. It was frustrating to do some of that research because, and Maud has this problem, facts are constantly clashing. I mean, when you read about the indigenous peoples of California, it's just contradiction after contradiction in the record. And so there are experts out there who have really done the work, the meticulous work, but it's hard, to get the right terms. And so instead of trying to get everything right when sometimes it felt impossible, I sort of gave that problem to Maud, who also experiences that frustration.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very realistic problem to have as somebody dealing with history, where it's just when so much gets lost. And that's something I've spoken to a lot of people who write historical fiction who've been trying to tell or include the stories of people whose history was deliberately not recorded in this country. So then, or deliberately, maybe it was recorded and then other people deliberately worked to erase those recordings.
Yeah,
so it is
absolutely. Yeah, and reading the history of Monticello and the gardens was a real. I mean, I got pissed off at Thomas Jefferson a lot when I was reading the history. But when you're dealing with labor, right? This is gardens or labor. Gardens require so much labor. Then you start to look at, well, who was actually doing the work? Not the people maybe strolling through the twilight garden, but the people who were out there digging and really making the garden happen and be alive. So, and Maud does that. So, I mean, she labors out there in the sun. I mean, she has a very physical job because she's both doing the research for the gardens, but then she also is actually doing the work of creating the gardens. So I felt she sort of bridged that. Like, she could not remain completely on some intellectual sphere because she knows how much work it takes to make these places come to life.
That is something, how these gardens are all named after, the people who own the land and not the people who actually made those gardens come into existence.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I maybe am not as passionate a gardener as your mother. I don't know. I'm getting competitive with your mother. No, I'm kidding. I'm actually completely not competitive about gardening. But yeah, I mean, I did garden quite a lot when I wrote this book, and I'm aware that I was sort of falling in love with the act of gardening, but I was also connecting to her and just the level of physical exhaustion. It's not always fun, weeding is not always fun. So that was a way, as I was writing, another way to connect to her character, because we're similar in some ways and we're different in some ways. She's from an Irish Catholic background, as am I, but she's from a very conservative politically conservative background, which I'm not. So, with any character, you have, for me, I need connection, and then I need distance, and separation to inhabit the person and find out something new about them.
And Maud was a great character to read. And one thing I loved was this sort of dichotomy you set up where Maud was seen by her family as like very non-traditional, as kind of breaking out of things, but then, left the country, but then kind of immediately locked herself into a very traditional marriage at a young age.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think she becomes increasingly aware of that over the course of the novel. So that's her journey. But she struggles with that when we think about history and the historical record. Like, what is her history and her historical record? Her family, her parents, in particular, her brother Kevin, like, they drive her crazy with their politics and with other things. But this is her family, So how do you deal with that? And I think that's I'm lucky that I don't have to deal with that in my immediate family. But I think a lot of us, right? There's the aunt or uncle, again, not in my case, but where you just really disagree with them on so many levels, and yet they're part of this unit, and there's all this love. And so how do you negotiate that?
No, one thing I loved was, I think pretty early on, Ella mentions the brother, Uncle Kevin, and is like, well, you'd think he was a jerk if you weren't related to him.
Right. Yeah.
Like,
that's true.
Yeah. I thought that was so funny, because there's so many people where it's like, would you even speak to this person if you hadn't had the coincidence of being related to them and growing up with them?
Yeah, and I think that's true of her a lot. And they do come through for her, but they really do drive her nuts as well. And so having to come back to the Bay Area and living near her family is another source of tension in the book. Even though, there aren't a lot of scenes with them, but they're important. And it's also a story about sisterhood. I mean, her sister Annette, she and her sister Annette are very close, even though they're different, but they've sort of navigated this family environment together. And so she provides support to Maud when things go south.
Yes.
with Ella. Yeah.
Yeah. For Ella, what was your real inspiration behind her character, and what happens to her is very central to the whole story of Hedge.
Right. Well, Ella is struggling with some mental health issues. I don't think that's giving away too much. I mean, I have an anxiety disorder, so I have spent my life navigating that. So I think I have, even though her issues are not mine, that allowed me to connect to her. And there's actually a section that comes close to being in her point of view, where Maud is imagining how Ella is feeling. And I could put a lot of my own sort of OCD stuff into that. So even though we remain in Maud's perspective, that's how I connected to that character and understood what she was going through. Because in that whole first part of the book, Maud is really, again, she's really transported by this new life, and she's really not seeing something that's going on with Ella. And so as I was writing, I was inhabiting both realities, if that makes sense. Even though I was in Maud's point of view, I was always aware of how Ella was reading the room. And Ella reacts. I mentioned this archaeologist, Gabriel, that Maud is having feelings for, and Ella picks up on that immediately. So there's tension there. And so when I was writing these scenes where they're all having dinner together, I knew how Maud was feeling, but I also knew how Ella was seeing things and what she was feeling. And so I never wrote explicitly in Ella's point of view, but I think kids know way more than we give them credit for. I mean, ask anybody who's had, an alcoholic in the family or any kind of, underground issue that no one talks about. The kids know so early on. They know what's going on, even if they can't say it. And I think Ella, like many kids, she's very aware of all of what's going on in her parents' marriage, but no one is saying it. So another question in the book is exploring for me is how much do we tell our kids? You know, how honest are we? And how can things backfire when we aren't?
Yes.
Yeah, when we hedge too much.
Yeah, no. Well, I did love that hedge is such a dual meaning title, where a hedge is something that Maud works with as a gardener, but also when you're hedging around problems, you end up kind of making them significantly worse often. And I think that point about children knowing is so incredibly true, where we romanticize childhood a lot. But it's a stressful time. You're very out of control of your circumstances. You're way more aware than a lot of adults will give you credit for. And, you know, as an adult myself, I even find myself being like, they probably won't figure that out. They're a kid. And then I'm not correct.
Right. And I do have two daughters who are very different from, disclaimer, very different from Ella and Louise. But I started writing Hedge right after I got divorced. So again, on a personal level, I had just gotten divorced. I was on my own financially with, you know, tons of support. I don't want to exaggerate. I had a safety net, but it was still frightening. I had never been really on my own like that. And, you know, money was tight, and I was dealing with all of these struggles that I hadn't dealt with before. And I had two young daughters. So that question of how do you create this new life for yourself when you make a decision like that, but also take care of the people you love, in particular your children, was on my mind when I was writing this book. And in some ways, I probably wrote into my worst fear, you know, the way things blow up, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's very fair. And it is where it's very understandable how Maud does miss this, because she does need to focus on herself too. But
yeah,
so
and I mean, I'm kind of playing, and again, you know, she's an agnostic or an atheist, but she was raised Catholic, and obviously we have a garden. I mean, obviously the Garden of Eden, the Fall from Grace, all of that is in there. But I don't feel like that Maud ever does anything quote unquote wrong. You know, it's just life aligns in a certain way, and then she has to untangle it. And I think, well, I don't want to give away the ending, but for me, it's really a story, even though there are these other important relationships, it's this mother-daughter story. And it's also about her finding herself and standing on her own 2 feet, which she had never done before, because she met her husband really young. And as you said, she settles into this traditional relationship that was modeled to her with even more sexism when she was growing up.
Yes. I really liked the way that Maud kind of comes to realize how she ended up in that situation, because I think we often don't give credit to how when we leave home, we're like, yeah, I'm leaving home, I'm doing it. And then we immediately recreate our home in some way.
Right. Yeah. I like the way you say that. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but yeah, even though she wants to leave the Bay Area, she wants to leave California for college, and then she wants to leave the country. She wants new territory, but then it's a little scary too, right? To be in that place where nothing is familiar. And so unconsciously she recreates, as you say, she recreates home again, even though that was the home she wanted to leave. Yeah. And sometimes only with time can you see that, you know, I mean, and so again, thinking about the first part of the book and the way Maud thinks things are going one way and then later learns they aren't. I mean, as someone who's now entered my 50s, I think there have been so many moments like that in my life where I look back to, you know, even a year or a couple of years down the road, I look back in time and I think, oh, I saw everything one way and it was another way, you know, with another person or even with myself sometimes. I think that's unavoidable. I have no solution to this, but
yes,
after this kind of cataclysmic event happens, Maud no longer trusts her own reactions. She no longer trusts her own impressions, which ultimately you can't live your life that way. So she has to learn to trust them again, I think, over the rest of the book.
And it is that thing that I appreciate of learning that terrible things can happen that you feel like you really should have stopped because, you know, it's to somebody you love or somebody who you are responsible for in the way you're responsible for your child, but it's also not your fault that they happened the way they happened.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's so much about how you react when you know they exist, right? That's really, I mean, for me, that's really the test, is do you face it with the person? And it's a mother-daughter book, but this bind exists for every human who loves other people, right? I mean, we all have people we're responsible for that sometimes get in the way of our path. And we have to stop on our path and take care of them before we can keep going. So
yeah, I also liked with Ella, even though, like you said, you don't write from her perspective ever truly, I loved the way it's kind of capturing that transition between truly being a child and becoming a young adult, and how that can be so awkward and frustrating and also heartbreaking at the same time. Were you really wanting to just capture what that transition feels like?
yes, and I think I was also interested, as I remember going through that transition, being 13, 14, and being seen differently, kind of sensing that I was being seen differently. And I saw it happen with my daughters too, where you suddenly sort of get reclassed, but in different ways by different people, but you haven't necessarily made that transition. And Ella is in sort of an affluent high school with a lot of peer pressure and just all of that kind of crappy baggage of being an American teenager, which she wasn't, because she was growing up in England. So there's actually culture shock for her. And she's figuring out, sex, and she's figuring out her own sexuality, and all of those things are going on. And so watching her mother falling for someone else has a whole other layer of complication for someone at that age, I think. And it definitely does for her.
Yes. And I do something of, being from the UK and going to the US, where we think of ourselves as like similar because we speak the same language, but it is a culture shock. Although it mentions that she tried to drop her accent to fit in. And I'm like, I don't know. I would feel like having a British accent, people would think that was cool.
Would be really cool. Yeah.
Maybe that's just what I would have thought. I don't know.
Well, you very well might have, and you would have gone through this period of life in a more adjusted way than she does. I mean, that's part of her. That's part of her problem. For her, her mental health issue is that she's struggling with. And again, it's a very typical. I mean, we talk about that all the time, right? American teenagers wanting to be the same. It's often, the minority of kids that are trying to be different. And I mean, hats off to them. But for her, that's also a sign of a deeper struggle that's going on, wanting to be invisible by fitting in. So she can suffer on her own, basically, in silence.
Yeah, and that's something that I love, perspectives like that. I myself was I was goth in high school. So
nice. Okay.
I was like, I'm so not mainstream. And so I got pulled into counselors a lot because people assume there must be something wrong with me.
Right.
But there's those people who are polite, they're smart, they're doing their best to fit in, and they actually have maybe a lot more going on than somebody who's confident enough to be, break out of that and be like, no, I'm going to be different. And yet we kind of ignore those struggles.
Right. Yeah. Bring more of those young women into the counseling office. Maybe.
Yes. Yeah.
And tell them to get a nose ring or something, or start to,
or, shop at a different store. Go find something weird at a thrift store and wear that.
Right. Go thrifting. That would be good. They should do sort of thrifting trips at high school thrifting trips, where everyone has to buy something a little different that they wouldn't feel comfortable wearing. Yeah. I mean, I went to a California public school with a lot of that kind of classic hierarchy, and I kind of always felt like a weirdo. I wasn't cool like you, so I wasn't goth. But I definitely know that feeling of not quite fitting in and being a little bit off. And I felt that way about my family too, actually, growing up, because it felt like we were the only Democrats in a 200-mile radius, which is certainly not true. It couldn't have been 200 miles, but and my mom worked and the other moms didn't work. And so we were just kind of off. And I think some young people can lean into that, and others just want that all to go away. And that's how Ella is. She wants it all to go away. She wants to feel, invisible, like I said.
And that's such a real problem, both for people going through that and for people who love people who are going through that.
Yeah, no, definitely. And she has a younger sister, Louise. I was interested in that age gap too, because Louise is 8, so she's just not there at all. So Louise was a fun character to write, because she, again, kids pick up on complexity, and I think she does as things go along. But in the storm of what's going on with Ella, it was sort of nice to have a little less aware Louise, along for the ride. So yeah, I wonder how she'll turn out. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I love that comparison too, because it reminds me kind of, I love the Golden Compass books. But,
oh yeah, I love those too. I read them a while ago, but oh yeah, they're great.
Yeah. But the main character at the beginning, she can read this magic device because she has the grace and confidence of a child, and then by the end she can't, because now she is a teenager and she's lost that thing that we all have as kids that lets us be a little more maybe confident than we. And I love seeing the dichotomy of one child who's still very much in that I have that strange, lovely confidence of childhood where I can do not whatever I want, but they're a lot more bold into where you've grown up, where you're so self-aware,
right?
You're limiting yourself so hard.
Yeah, the lack of self-awareness is so great. It's really sad that we lose that. I think it's good to try to get that back as we get older. I don't know that I'm going to be able to work on that, in these weeks after my book just comes out. It's not exactly an unself-aware time, but I do think that as I get older, that's something I would really like to re-achieve, because it's a really beautiful quality.
And I think as artists, especially, when you first start writing, I've been writing since I was really young, and when I first started writing, I was just writing whatever the heck I wanted. And now when you get older, you can't get rid of the is this any good? Is this actually good? Right. And that's the most irritating thought to have.
It is. I mean, do you have a way around that? I'm curious. Do you have any tricks that help you with that?
What I try to do is really just try to be more self-indulgent, where I try to remember that in the end, I'm writing this for me, because who knows, maybe no one else on the planet will ever actually end up reading this.
Right.
So if this is something I would enjoy reading or I find interesting to write, it's good to someone, it's good to me, and then maybe it'll be good to other people too.
Yeah, it's almost like we have to tell ourselves these things constantly. I mean, I do. I also, for me, if I write first thing in the morning, I'm just less critical. I'm less critical at that time, but I find that I'm way more critical in the afternoon. So I try to revise in the afternoon, and draft in the morning. But it's the best. I mean, that first summer with Hedge, when it was just me and the manuscript working on it in my garden, no eyes on it. It's a wonderful thing, isn't it? That blessed first draft before you have to, show it to people and start doing the really hard work of revision.
And you did mention your tour. I did want to ask, how is your tour with Zibby Books, which is a newer company and trying to do things a little differently than traditional publishing companies?
Well, one of the things that they're doing, and it's just been a great experience being with Zibby Books. I was one of the first authors on board. My book was acquired by Lee Newman, and way back, I don't know, I can't do the math, but it was one of the first books. So I've really seen this company just take steam and bring on all these wonderful people, and so it's cool. I mean, I feel a lot of affection for my publishing house, which I don't think is that common of a thing. But one of the really nice initiatives is that every author gets a tour. I mean, there really isn't a pecking order of, the big title and the smaller title. Everybody gets a tour. And so, so they're sending me I'm going to the Hudson Valley on Saturday for an event at Montgomery Place. And then I'm going out to California and doing some readings in Boston. And, there's so much self-doubt with writing, and there are going to be people who don't like your book. I mean, there's Goodreads, like all of these things exist, but to talk to someone in person who read your book and really connected to it is so great. I mean, for me, it makes it makes the publishing part worth it, not necessarily the writing part, which, as you've been talking about, is kind of it is a different beast, or we try to keep it that way. So that I'm really excited about these events. And I'm going to see, some of the Zibby Book, the managing editor and our publisher will be at the event on Saturday. So it'll be great.
Yes. So we're kind of winding down, and this is one of my favorite few last questions to ask, which is there anything that I didn't ask about the book or your tour or anything that you'd like to talk about?
Oh, that is a good question. Well, I will just say that later on in the book, because so much happens with the plot, I don't get a chance to talk too much about the character of Ellis, who is a friend that Maud makes in that second part of the book when she's back in the Bay Area. And she's an artist who has given up art and has become sort of a hermit on the California coast. And the two of them start hiking together. And I think that relationship, that friendship I think I was interested in exploring how friendship, in particular here between women, because this is something that I've experienced in my life, can be just as sustaining and nourishing and important as, any kind of romantic relationship. So she was a really fun character to write. And it was also her, the fact that she does 2 daily hikes, like long hikes. And I loved the idea of a life like that, because in some ways I would like to live like Ellis, just cut off from all, no cell signal, no cell phone, and just living in a rhythm with the landscape, and especially that beautiful landscape. So,
No, I also was very envious. I don't know if I could truly, if rubber hit the road with that life, I don't know if I could truly hack it, but loved. I was like, darn, I kind of wish that was me doing that.
Yeah, right. I know. Yeah. Yeah. And you know how it is with writing. Sometimes you get to, part of the reason that it's fun is we do get to inhabit these worlds or live these lives a little bit that we ourselves don't. So I liked living that life with Ellis for a while there.
Yes. All right. And for our last question, what are you doing next, and where can people find you?
So next, I am tomorrow morning hopping in the car and driving to the Hudson Valley with my daughter, Margot. And on Saturday, I have an event at 2:00 at Montgomery Place Bard, which is, again, the setting for the first part of the book. Free cookies and lemonade. You can find the link to get a ticket on my website. But it should be really wonderful. I'm going to be in conversation with Amy Perella, who's the head of horticulture at Bard. So people who are interested in gardening and gardens will, I think, really enjoy that event. And then I go out to the Bay Area, and I have a reading at Orinda Books on the 13th of June, and then Book Passage on the 14th. So all of my events are listed on my website. And again, I love meeting readers. So it would be great if people come out. Yes.
And we also got this really nice comment from Melissa that she's heard nothing but rave reviews from friends about this and can't wait to read it. I also can't wait for you to read it, Melissa, because it is a really amazing book, and I think you'll really enjoy it once you get your hands on it.
Thank you so much, Melissa. This is what I mean about these are the things that make the worth feel like it's paid off a little. So thank you. Thank you for saying that.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Jane. And everybody watching, thank you also for joining us. Make sure you like, follow, and subscribe for more amazing authors like Jane DeLury. And we will see you all in the future.
And thank you. I love talking to you.